Jiang Qing, the Tyrant Empress of Mao's Court. Part 1. Roots in Shandong. A Childhood of Shadows and Scars. Jiang Qing, born in March 1914 in the town of Zucheng, Shandong Province, emerged into the world not amid privilege or affection, but under the heavy cloud of familial dysfunction, emotional deprivation, and socioeconomic instability. The name by which history would remember her Jiang Qing was only one among many she would adopt during her turbulent and shape-shifting life. But her journey began as Li Shumeng, though she would also answer to Li Jin, Li Yunhei, Lan Ping, and other aliases, before settling on the name that would come to symbolize revolution and ruin. Her father, Li Duan, worked as a carpenter and cabinet maker, honest work that provided modest income but little stability. Jiang's mother, whose full name remains uncertain in historical records, was not his first wife, but a concubinea socially marginal status that would contribute to the marginalization of both mother and daughter within the family. Li Duan's primary wife had failed to bear children, leading him to take another woman, Jiang's mother, in hopes of securing an heir. Instead, he got a daughter. The disappointment was immediate and profound. Her birth was met not with celebration but with indifference, even resentment. According to later reports, her father had hoped for a son and initially gave the infant a masculine name, Li Jinan or Li Jinhai, both of which translate roughly as the coming boy or the arriving child. It was a bitter omen for the life that awaited her. The household into which Jiang was born was one where abuse was routine and emotional warmth was absent. Her father's temperament was volatile, his anger frequent and brutal. He took out his frustrations on his concubine and their daughter in ways that left deep emotional and physical scars. On one occasion, during the Lantern Festivala holiday, meant to be joyful and luminous, shattered her mother's finger in a fit of rage. That night, mother and daughter fled, stealing away under cover of darkness. They left behind more than a house. They abandoned any hope of a normal family life. The years that followed were a constant struggle for survival. Jiang's mother, now alone and without resources, found work as a domestic servant. The lines between servitude and prostitution blurred as she did whatever she could to ensure her daughter would not starve. The indignities of such work were many, and Jiang, still just a child, internalized the shame and social stigma. Her mother's efforts to gain support from her estranged husband or his family were largely futile. They moved frequently between Jinan, Zucheng, and later Tianjin in search of shelter, employment, and dignity. None came easily. Jiang Qing's early schooling was erratic and disrupted by poverty. She attended 2 primary schools in Zucheng, where her classmates mocked her worn, ill-fitting hand-me-downs, many of which were boys' clothing salvaged from her mother's former employers or relatives. She became withdrawn, sensitive to ridicule, and increasingly quiet. Teachers described her as bright but aloof, observant but guarded. She learned early that kindness was a rare commodity and that vulnerability was dangerous. In the late 1920s, Jiang and her mother briefly found shelter with relatives in Tianjin. There, Jiang worked as a housemaid for wealthier relatives. She suggested taking a job in a cigarette-rolling factory to earn money, but her guardians disapproved, perhaps recognizing the degradation such labor often entailed. Eventually, they returned to Jinan. There, tragedy struck. In 1928, when Jiang was only 14, her mother succumbed to illness, likely aggravated by years of physical exhaustion and emotional stress. Jiang was now an orphan. Alone in the world, the teenage girl had little reason to trust anyone. Her experiences had taught her that survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and emotional armor. But even amid the bleakness, a spark began to flicker. She discovered theater. It was in Jinan that Jiang first encountered the world of performance and found something approximating refuge. A local underground theatrical troupe likely associated with leftist agitators influenced by the May 4th movement offered her both a community and a platform. Her expressive face, large eyes, and keen stage presence quickly drew attention. Though her acting skills were still unrefined, her raw, emotional power captivated audiences. Here, at last, was a realm in which she could reshape her identity, conceal her shame, and wield control over perception tools that she would perfect in later years. Her grandparents, worried about her sudden disappearance into the bohemian world of theater, intervened and forced her return, but the damager transformation had already begun. Jiang was no longer content to live the life of a quiet, broken girl. She had seen a glimpse of freedom and self-definition. She enrolled at the Experimental Arts Academy, an institution that had loosened its rigid admission standards following the cultural upheavals of the May 4th movement. The academy, located in Jinan, offered Jiang something rare, recognition of her talent without regard to her social origins. Though her thick Shandong accent initially hindered her performance in classical roles, her progress was swift and steady. She immersed herself in traditional opera, learned stagecraft, and honed her speaking and singing abilities. Her tutors noted both her diligence and her ambition. She was not the best student in terms of technique, but she had presence a quality that would follow her throughout life, commanding attention whether on stage or in the political arena. By 1930, the school had closed due to financial troubles, and Jiang, barely 16 and still not fully trained, was recommended to theatrical companies in Beijing. It was her first real step into China's cultural elite. Yet even as she embraced the glamour and artifice of the stage, Jiang remained a product of trauma, secrecy, and longing. Her past, shadowed by violence, abandonment, and hunger, never let go. Her transition from orphan to actress, from Li Shumeng to Lan Ping, from abused daughter to self-possessed performer, was now well underway. But the path ahead through celebrity, ideology, revolution, and infamy would demand far more than talent. It would require ruthless adaptability, the suppression of conscience, and a hunger for power that her impoverished childhood had only sharpened. Jiang Qing had survived her early years through silence, retreat, and performance. In the decades to come, she would survive by commanding the stage of Chinese history and forcing others to play by her script. Part 2. From Lan Ping to Revolutionary, the theatrical roads of Qingdao and Shanghai. With her formal theatrical training cut short by the closure of the Experimental Arts Academy, Jiang Qing found herself propelled into the uncertain world of China's performing arts scene. Barely 16, still bearing the emotional and physical weight of her troubled childhood, she ventured into the realm of professional theater and cinema. Her beauty was undeniable. She possessed sharp, striking features and carried herself with a grace that masked her past. But it was her ambition, burning just beneath the surface, that began to set her apart. In the early 1930s, she would begin the metamorphosis that would ultimately lead from stage to political stage. Returning to Jinan in May 1931, Jiang entered into her first marriage, though accounts of this union are scarce and brief. She wed Pei Minglun, a businessman's son. The marriage, likely an attempt at social stability, quickly fell apart. She divorced Pei soon after, perhaps disillusioned by the limitations of domestic life or simply unwilling to relinquish her independence. It was clear that Jiang was not destined for the quiet life of a provincial wife. In the wake of her divorce, she reached out to an important figure from her educational past, Zhao Taimu, the former director of the Arts Academy and now the dean of Qingdao University. With the help of Zhao's wife, the actress Yushan Jiang secured a modest position as a clerk in the university's library. Though it was not a performance job, this post placed her back within intellectual and artistic circles. It was through Yushan that Jiang Qing was introduced to a man who would profoundly shape her ideological path, Yu Qiwei, known by his revolutionary alias Li Desheng. Yu was not only a rising figure in China's underground communist circles, but also a man of charisma, intellectual depth, and elite social standing. Born into a prominent family, he had renounced privilege in favor of revolution. He was deeply involved in literature, theater, and Marxist activism. For Jiang, the connection with Yu was not merely romantic. It was her initiation into political life. The pair began living together, scandalous for the time, and Yu ushered Jiang into the Communist Cultural Front, where art and ideology merged in resistance to both Japanese imperialism and Kuomintang (KMT) repression. The early 1930s were a period of awakening for Jiang. Japan's 1931 Mukden incident and the subsequent invasion of Manchuria inflamed her nationalist sentiment. She began performing in explicitly political plays with the Seaside Drama Society, a leftist troupe in Qingdao. She took on roles in agitprop productions like Lay Down Your Whip, which depicted Chinese suffering under foreign aggression and the neglect of the ruling class. In February 1933, she joined the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, officially an act that would forever entwine her destiny with that of revolutionary China. However, this new life was fraught with danger. In July 1933, Yu Qiwei was arrested by the KMT secret police. His detention placed Jiang at risk of exposure, and she was forced to flee Qingdao. Yu Shan, ever supportive, arranged for Jiang's relocation to Shanghai, a cosmopolitan hub teeming with both artists and agents of surveillance. In Shanghai, she began to build her reputation as an actress under the stage name Lan Ping, meaning Blue Apple. With introductions from Yu Shan and Tian Luanthi, brother of renowned playwright Tian Hanjiang, found work first as a visiting student at Great China University and then as a teacher at Chenggang Workers' School, organized by the progressive educator Tao Xingji. She immersed herself once more in leftist cultural activism, joining the League of Left-Wing Educators and the Chinese Communist Youth League. Her political convictions and artistic ambitions now ran in tandem. She joined the Shanghai Work-Study Troupe, performing in plays like Roar, China, which was banned by British colonial authorities in the city's international settlement for its anti-imperialist message. Jiang was becoming a recognizable figure within revolutionary art circles, yet she was also drawing dangerous attention from the KMT's secret police. In September 1934, Jiang was arrested by the KMT and jailed for 3 months. She was interrogated by Zhao Yaoshan, a Zhongtong agent, to whom she allegedly revealed that a fellow activist, Tan Xiaoqing, was a communistan incident that would return to haunt her decades later during her purge of counter-revolutionaries. After her release, Jiang made her way to Beijing, reunited with the recently freed Yu Qiwei, and resumed her life as a political and artistic insurgent. By March 1935, she had returned to Shanghai. It was here that she joined the Diantong Film Company, where her acting talents reached a broader audience. Her performance as Nora in Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House earned acclaim for its emotional resonance and symbolic importance. Nora's rebellion against a controlling husband mirrored Jiang's own defiance of traditional female roles. She starred in films like Goddess of Freedom and Scenes of City Life, during which she fell in love with writer Tang Na, her colleague at Diantong. The two began living together by September of that year. However, Jiang's emotional life was anything but stable. She lied to Tang, claiming that her mother was gravely ill, and secretly traveled to Tianjin to visit Yu Qiwei. Tang, upon discovering her deception, attempted suicide in Jinan but later forgave her and returned with her to Shanghai. They were married in April 1936 in a collective ceremony at the Luhei Pagoda in Hangzhou, unusual event attended by other progressive artists and couples. In 1936 and 1937, Jiang continued her acting career at the Lianhua Film Company, appearing in Blood on Wolf Mountain, Lianhua Symphony, and other notable films. She began a new affair with director Zhang Min, whom she met while working on his film The Storm. The relationship cost her dearly. After Tang Na's second suicide attempt, she divorced him, and soon afterward, Lianhua dismissed her, effectively ending her mainstream acting career. By 1937, Shanghai was no longer a safe space. Her public affair with Tang Na had deeply tarnished her reputation. Theater gossip columns skewered her for perceived moral lapses. Politically, Japan's invasion of China had begun in earnest with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and revolutionary youth looked increasingly to Yan'an, the communist base in the north, as a beacon of resistance and renewal. The city, glorified through party propaganda, promised sanctuary, purpose, and ideological purity. It represented a clean slate. Jiang Qing, burned by love and betrayed by the elite art world of Shanghai, made her choice. In July 1937, she departed for Yan'an, just before Japanese troops poured into Shanghai. There, she would shed the name Lan Ping for good and re-emerge as a new figure, ready to write her next act not as a performer of roles, but as a force shaping the very stage of China's future. Part 3. Yan'an from stage actress to revolutionary consort. When Jiang Qing arrived in Yan'an in the latter part of 1937, she entered a world radically different from the bustling cities of Qingdao or Shanghai. Yan'an, the rugged, dusty base of the Chinese Communist Party in the mountainous interior of Shandong Province, was the ideological and physical heart of the revolution. Here, material hardship was considered a badge of revolutionary virtue, and intellectual and political life pulsed with fervor under the shadow of looming Japanese aggression and the retreat of Kuomintang rule. It was in Yan'an that Jiang would not only redefine herself once again, but where she would enter history's main stage. To many young revolutionaries, Yan'an was a promised land. It was romanticized as a utopia of simplicity and comradeship, a place where youth, ideology, and passion converged in pursuit of a better world. For Jiang, it offered more than ideological clarity. It offered reinvention. She abandoned the name Lan Ping, the name associated with scandal, celebrity, and bourgeois Shanghai, and adopted Jiang Qing, meaning river and azure, or clarity. The new name, symbolic and poetic, aligned her with nature and renewal. She was no longer the actress of nightclubs and scandal sheets. She was a revolutionary, a woman of the people. Despite the harsh living conditions in Yan'an, Jiang adapted quickly. She joined the newly established Li Shumeng Academy of Arts, named after the literary titan who had championed revolutionary thought through the written word. The academy, founded in April 1938, became a hub of cultural education and propaganda, training the artists and performers of the communist movement. Jiang became a teacher in the drama department. She taught acting, performed in political plays, and participated in productions designed to rouse the revolutionary spirit of peasants and soldiers alike. Her talents extended beyond the stage. Jiang Qing's calligraphy, especially in regular script, was noted for its elegance. She could tailor clothes with precision, knit intricate patterns, and sing both classical opera and revolutionary ballads. She was not a battlefield revolutionary, but in Yan'an's cultural and domestic spheres, she excelled. She loved horseback riding, especially taming wild horses, and, though she avoided weapons training, her daring on horseback earned admiration from her comrades. Her dual, nature-affying, yet rugged, reserved, yet assertive captivated many, including the most powerful man in Yan'an, Mao Zedong. It was sometime in late 1937 or early 1938 that Jiang Qing and Mao Zedong began a romantic relationship. Mao, already in his mid-40s and a towering figure within the CCP, had been married to He Zizhen, a Long March veteran and mother of several of his children. But he had been severely wounded in the struggle and had departed Yan'an for treatment. The breakdown of their marriage, largely due to political differences and emotional estrangement, left Mao free but not unburdened. When rumors of his involvement with Jiang Qing emerged, the reaction within the party was swift and controversial. Many senior party members were scandalized. Zhang Wentian, a key CCP leader, voiced sharp disapproval, arguing that he, Zizhen, as a wounded veteran and a loyal revolutionary, deserved respect, and that Mao's courtship of a former Shanghai actress would be damaging both morally and politically. Others, like Kang Sheng, offered full support, arguing that Mao's private life should be his own affair. Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi, more cautious and pragmatic, contacted party officials in Shanghai, seeking to verify Jiang's political background. Concerns arose that she may have been involved with the Kuomintang or had acted as a double agent. Yang Fan, a party figure in Shanghai, secretly wrote to Yan'an warning that Jiang was unsuitable to marry Mao. The debate reached the Politburo, and though opposition persisted, Mao, as party chairman, ultimately prevailed. On 28 November 1938, he formally married Jiang Qing. However, The union was approved with 3 strict conditions. Jiang Qing could not publicly be recognized as Mao's wife due to the unresolved status of his marriage with He Zizhen and the potential scandal it might provoke. She would serve solely as Mao's caregiver, tending to his daily needs and health, and would not involve herself in party business. She was strictly barred from holding any party or government positions and prohibited from engaging in political activity or influencing party appointments for 20 years. For Jiang, the marriage was both a victory and a restraint. She had secured her position beside the most powerful man in China, but with significant limitations. In the eyes of many, she was to remain silent, supportive, and invisible. It was a role she would accept only temporarily. In the early years of their marriage, Jiang did not yet challenge these constraints. She lived quietly, managing Mao's personal life, preparing his meals, caring for his clothing, and guarding his health. In 1940, she gave birth to Li Na, their only child together. After Li Na's birth, Jiang largely retreated from public life, perhaps to fulfill the party's conditions or perhaps biding her time. While she remained Mao's companion and confidant, she stayed in the background, silently observing the power structures around her. Despite the restrictions, Jiang remained politically aware. She continued to absorb the teachings of Mao Zedong thought, paid close attention to party rivalries, and read voraciously about global political movements. Her quietude was strategic, not submission. She understood that the revolution was not yet complete and that her moment might still come. That opportunity began to take shape as the communist movement gained momentum in the 1940s and 1950s. But first, her health and her reputation would face severe tests, even as she stood beside the architect of China's future. Part 4. First Lady in the Shadows, Post-War Transition, Film Bureaucracy and Medical Exile. After the communist victory in 1949 and the founding of the People's Republic of China, Jiang Qing, now the legal wife of Chairman Mao Zedong, assumed a new but paradoxically ambiguous position in the emerging socialist state. She was, in effect, China's First Lady, the spouse of the revolution's supreme leader. Yet despite this powerful association, she was largely sidelined during the first decade of the People's Republic. The terms of her 1938 marriage agreement still held. She was to remain politically silent and uninvolved. This did not mean she was without influence, but it did mean she operated behind the scenes, often in cultural or symbolic roles that concealed her political ambitions. She appeared occasionally at diplomatic functions and state ceremonies, but Chinese media did not publicize her name or role, nor was she introduced formally to foreign dignitaries. In many cases, she was referred to simply as a comrade, or she remained unnamed altogether. Mao was protective of her image, but also wary of the political cost of her notoriety. Yet, Jiang Qing was far from idle. Beneath the polite public face she presented in the 1950s, her ambition remained simmering. She began to explore a niche that would serve as her eventual launchpad into real power: culture, cinema, and propaganda. Cultural bureaucracy and early interventions. Jiang was appointed to several cultural and administrative posts within the Chinese Communist Party. Her most significant early position was Deputy Director of the Film Guidance Committee from 1949 to 1951, where she oversaw film evaluation and cultural programming. In 1951, she was given the title of Chief of the Film Bureau, a seemingly minor bureaucratic office, but one with profound implications. In post-revolutionary China, culture was not entertainment. It was a political weapon. Art served ideology, and cinema was a tool for educating the masses and shaping revolutionary consciousness. Almost immediately, Jiang began to assert her aesthetic and ideological preferences, clashing with cultural conservatives and even party moderates. Her first major intervention came when she criticized the 1950 Hong Kong film Sorrows of the Forbidden City, which portrayed the late Qing court in romantic terms. She denounced the film as unpatriotic and reactionary, claiming it glorified monarchy and insulted the revolutionary cause. Her objections were initially dismissed by the Ministry of Culture as overblown. However, Mao Zedong personally intervened to support her, signaling that his wife's cultural opinions carried weight. Shortly afterward, Jiang objected to the screening of The Life of Wu Xun, a biopic about a 19th-century scholar who founded schools for the poor through private charity. Jiang viewed Wu Xun as a symbol of feudal morality, not revolutionary change. Again, the party initially brushed her concerns aside, but once more, Mao intervened on her behalf. These episodes set a pattern. Jiang would raise cultural objections, the bureaucracy would resist, and Mao would side with her, often retroactively. Jiang's growing influence was further cemented in 1955 when she took a key role on the Ministry of Culture's steering committee for film production. From this position, she could approve or deny projects, shape ideological narratives, and assert her belief in what she called socialist realism with revolutionary fervor. She insisted that art must elevate the proletariat and cast down all remnants of feudalism, bourgeois sentimentality, and Western decadence. In essence, she was preparing the ideological foundation for what would later become cultural orthodoxy during the Cultural Revolution, health crisis, and Soviet exile. Despite her rising influence in culture, Jiang Qing's ability to work was hampered throughout the 1950s by chronic health issues. She suffered from multiple ailments, the most serious being cervical cancer, which was diagnosed in 1949. Chinese doctors, limited by political campaigns like the Three Antis movement, were often unable to provide the care she needed, and so, with Mao's approval, Jiang traveled to the Soviet Union for advanced treatment. Her first trip to Moscow and Yalta occurred in 1949. There, she underwent medical procedures under the care of Soviet specialists. She returned to China in autumn, but further complications sent her back to Moscow in 1952, where she stayed until late 1953. During one of her surgeries, Soviet doctors even explored her liver due to severe pain, raising concerns that extended beyond her diagnosed illness. Another round of treatment followed in 1956, 1957. These extended stays were not just medical retreats. They were isolating periods that also offered her rare privileges. In Moscow, Jiang had access to Western films banned in both the USSR and China, including Hollywood productions and European classics. These experiences significantly shaped her later aesthetic sensibilities. Though a communist hardliner, Jiang was deeply attracted to the emotional richness and technical mastery of Western art. She began to formulate ideas about how Chinese art could be transformed not by imitation, but by elevating revolutionary content through disciplined, accessible, and modern form. Her Soviet stays were strictly secluded. She had no direct contact with local citizens, and her only reading materials came through the Chinese diplomatic mission. Nevertheless, the exposure to foreign art fed her growing sense that China's artistic revolution was far from complete and that she might someday be the one to lead it. Jiang's final trip to the Soviet Union ended in 1957. Doctors declared her recovered from cancer, but she remained convinced that she was still unwell. Some interpreted this insistence as psychosomatic, even hypochondriacal. Doctors in Beijing prescribed therapeutic activities to keep her mentally engaged, watching films, listening to music, photography, and attending operas. Early signs of vindictiveness. Even as Jiang occupied herself with music and photography, she had not forgotten those who had doubted her loyalty in Yan'an or challenged her authority. The late 1950s saw a quiet campaign of retribution. Zhao Yaoshan, the KMT agent who interrogated her during her 1934 arrest, was executed during the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. In 1953, Yang Fan, the party cadre who had warned against Jiang's marriage to Mao, was imprisoned. Even Pan Hanian, a respected communist intelligence chief who had defended Yang, was later arrested and silenced. Jiang's enemies, both real and imagined, began to vanish. In March 1958, during a visit to Guangzhou, Mao encountered Yu Qiwei, Jiang's former lover and revolutionary mentor. Mao humiliated him for his past association with Jiang. Deeply shamed, Yu attempted suicide and later died under ambiguous circumstances. Mao, tellingly, sent a wreath in his name only cold, formal, and final. These acts of erasure, vengeance, and historical cleansing were early indicators of Jiang's emerging disposition. Beneath her polished exterior, she harbored a long memory and a deep sense of grievance. She had not only survived poverty, betrayal, and exilage, was now wielding quiet power, and she was keeping score. As the 1960s approached, Jiang's cultural authority continued to expand. Her health had stabilized, her enemies were being neutralized, and Mao, increasingly distrustful of the party establishment, began to lean on her instincts and rhetoric once again. Her decades of waiting were about to pay off. The stage was being set for her starring role in the most turbulent drama of 20th century Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution. Part 5. The Prelude to Upheaval. Cultural Crusade and Political Reawakening. By the early 1960s, Jiang Qing had endured over a decade of relative obscurity. Despite her symbolic status as Mao Zedong's wife, her official influence remained modest, mostly confined to cultural institutions and private discussions with the chairman. Yet this period of marginalization had not been idle. Behind the scenes, Jiang studied her environment with a survivor's precision, watching China's post-revolutionary elite drift away from ideological fervor and into pragmatic governance. She believed, as Mao increasingly did, that the revolutionary fire was flickering and she prepared herself to reignite it. Jiang's political resurgence began not with a dramatic coup, but with a seemingly modest domain, Peking opera. Her passion for art, sharpened through her years as an actress and cultural bureaucrat, was about to become a vehicle for political revival. Mao's disillusionment with the Communist Party bureaucracy after the disasters of the Great Leap Forward, 1958-1961, created a political vacuum. He viewed many of his colleagues, including President Liu Shaoqi, as revisionists betraying the revolutionary cause. In Jiang, Mao saw someone who had always remained ideologically pure and fiercely loyal to his personal vision. It was against this backdrop that Jiang began inserting herself once more into China's public life. She returned to Beijing from extended stays in Moscow and Hangzhou, now in good health and intellectually invigorated. While Mao grew increasingly aloof and distrustful, Jiang became more outspoken, more politically assertive. Her years of cultural work had hardened her belief that art must serve ideology and that many in China's cultural establishment were failing in this duty. The Cultural Offensive. Reforming opera. Jiang Qing's first major initiative was the reform of Beijing opera, also known as Peking opera, a traditional art form steeped in the aesthetics and narratives of imperial China. To Jiang, this was a problem. The lavish costumes, courtly etiquette, and tales of emperors and scholars clashed violently with socialist ideals. It was not just an artistic issue, it was ideological heresy. In 1962, Jiang began attending performances with increasing regularity. She met with artists, composers, and directors, often unannounced, and began to gather allies sympathetic to her views. One of her earliest and most important collaborators was Yu Huiyong, a talented musician and administrator who would help bring her aesthetic vision to life. Jiang also found loyal supporters in Zhang Chungqiao and Yao Wenyuan, two Shanghai-based propagandists and future members of the notorious Gang of Four. In 1963, Jiang officially enlisted Jia, a prominent dramatist, to help modernize opera with socialist themes. She charged the Beijing Municipal Opera Company with producing Shajibang, a tale set during the Second Sino-Japanese War, highlighting communist heroism. Simultaneously, she instructed the Shanghai Beijing Opera Company to create Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, another Revolutionary War drama. These productions would form the kernel of what would later be known as Yangbangshi, or model operas. At the 1964 Peking Opera Convention, Jiang delivered her first major public speech, sharply condemning traditional operas for glorifying emperors, generals, scholars, and beauties, a reference to characters from feudal, bourgeois, or mythological origins. In Jiang's new vision, the arts must celebrate workers, peasants, and soldiers, the three great revolutionary classes. She declared that culture must serve politics and that aesthetic beauty must reflect revolutionary truth. The communist leadership was initially skeptical of her intensity, but Mao backed her enthusiastically. These early speeches marked her return to the political limelight. She was no longer just a figure behind the chairman, she was a speaker, critic, and emerging power in her own right. The three prominences and political aesthetics. Jiang's theatrical reforms were not limited to themes and characters, they extended to music, choreography, lighting, and even costume design. She declared that modern revolutionary works must follow what she termed the three prominences: the prominence of positive characters over negative ones, the prominence of heroes over supporting roles, and most importantly, the prominence of the principal hero above all others. In practice, this meant that protagonists, whether they were Red Army soldiers, model workers, or female guerrilla leaders, must dominate the stage, both visually and morally. She also encouraged the simplification of language in operas and plays to make them accessible to common people. Jiang's vision of art was didactic, ideological, and unyielding. It was not enough for culture to entertain, it had to educate and mobilize. Even music had to obey ideological laws. Lyrics were to be written in standard Mandarin, not regional dialects, and melodies had to match natural speech tones, making them clear and easy for the people to understand. Her obsession with revolutionary purity extended to rejecting certain music styles. When Du Mingxin, a composer working on the ballet, The Red Detachment of Women, used melodies reminiscent of 1930s Shanghai nightclubs, Jiang dismissed them as erotic ballads, meant to poison the revolutionary spirit. Humiliated and accused of ideological sabotage, Du rewrote the music under the supervision of Yu Huiyang, who tactfully mediated between Jiang's blunt criticism and the artist's fragile morale. Despite her severity, Jiang displayed flashes of genuine artistic insight. Her instincts for stage composition, dramatic pacing, and symbolic gesture were sharp, and with the full weight of Mao's endorsement behind her, even skeptical artists had no choice but to obey. Political emergence. The rise of a cultural commissar. By 1965, Jiang Qing was no longer operating quietly within cultural committees. Her reform efforts were attracting attention at the highest levels of the CCP. Her alliance with Zheng Chunqiao and Yao Wenyuan became more formalized, and together, they began organizing a national campaign to criticize the play Hai Rui Dismissed from Office, a work interpreted as a veiled attack on Mao's policies. This campaign would eventually spiral into a nationwide purge of intellectuals and officials and mark the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. In early 1966, Jiang hosted a confidential forum for senior People's Liberation Army officers, where they studied Mao's writings, watched Jiang's curated film and opera selections, and concluded that a black line of bourgeois ideology had long dominated the arts. The minutes from this forum would later be distributed nationally, becoming a foundational document in the Cultural Revolution's cultural policy. By April 1966, Jiang was presiding over the All-Army Artistic Creation Conference, which evaluated over 80 domestic and foreign films. Jiang approved only 7 as being consistent with Mao Zedong thought. She denounced the rest, often with harsh ideological rebukes. Her influence now extended across the military, the arts, and the party's cultural machinery. Then came her political breakthrough. In May 1966, with Mao's direct support, Jiang Qing was appointed Deputy Director of the Central Cultural Revolution Group, CCRG, a new and powerful body designed to implement Mao's vision of revolutionary renewal. It was here that Jiang Qing transformed from a cultural commissar into a true political force zone, whose reach would eventually rival that of China's most powerful men. Her vengeance against her former critics, her thirst for control over the national imagination, and her fervent belief in ideological purity would soon converge into a political storm that would engulf the nation. The Cultural Revolution was no longer on the horizon. It had begun. Part 6. The Cultural Revolution Unleashed. Power, Purge, and the Rise of the Great Flag Bearer. With her appointment as Deputy Director of the Central Cultural Revolution Group, CCRG, in May 1966, Jiang Qing emerged not merely as Mao Zedong's wife, but as a dominant political figure in her own right. The Cultural Revolution, the sweeping political and social movement that would come to define the final decade of Mao's rule, offered Jiang the perfect platform to execute her long-held vision. An ideologically pure society, a revolutionized cultural order, and personal vengeance against those who had mocked, doubted, or sidelined her in the past. No longer constrained by her earlier vows to remain politically inactive, Jiang stepped fully into the political limelight. As Mao retreated from daily governance, wary of the party bureaucracy and aging leadership, he increasingly delegated authority to trusted radicals, foremost among them, his wife. With Mao's backing and protection, Jiang would use the CCRG not only to spearhead ideological purges and control propaganda, but also to reshape China's very cultural consciousness. Revolutionary operas. Jiang's artistic weaponry. In 1967, Jiang Qing announced a set of model revolutionary works, a canon of 8 operas, ballets, and symphonies designed to replace traditional Chinese performance arts. These included The Red Detachment of Women, Shajiabang, Raid on the White Tiger Regiment, and Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. Known collectively as the Yang Bangxi, or model plays, these works represented Jiang's core artistic doctrine: glorification of the proletariat, the People's Liberation Army, and Maoist heroism. Jiang claimed that these productions were created by the masses, but in truth, she had overseen every detail from costumes and lighting to musical arrangements and character arcs. Her personal tastes blended Western ballet with Chinese melodies, resulting in a hybrid form that was both novel and ideologically rigid. She demanded clarity, simplicity, and total moral alignment. The heroes were always communists, the villains always class enemies. Any shades of ambiguity or human complexity were excised. In these works, art became pure propaganda. But it was propaganda, polished to perfection, visually striking, musically powerful, and emotionally charged. Even foreign visitors, like U.S. President Richard Nixon during his 1972 visit to China, were impressed. Nixon famously asked who the director and composer of The Red Detachment of Women was. Jiang replied simply, "Created by the masses, the public image, great flag bearer and white-boned demon." As the Cultural Revolution intensified, Jiang Qing's visibility soared. State-run media glorified her as the great flag-bearer of the proletarian Cultural Revolution and published posters showing her alongside Mao, or even alone, standing above the masses, a symbolic guardian of ideological purity. She took part in mass rallies, spoke at national forums, and was present in the selection and promotion of leading Red Guard figures. But admiration was far from universal. While some students and artists saw her as a liberator of oppressed voices, many older cadres, intellectuals, and party veterans regarded her as dangerous and vindictive. Her old nickname, White-Bone Demon, taken from a villainous character in the Chinese classic Journey, to the West resurfaced in underground whispers, and later in state propaganda following her downfall. Jiang's personality was polarizing. In meetings, she was often shrill, combative, and intolerant of dissent. She rarely hid her disdain for those she considered ideologically impure or aesthetically backward. She carried herself with dramatic flair, often donning military-style uniforms and red armbands. She was theatrical by nature, and she embraced the performance of revolution as earnestly as she had embraced performance on the stage. Vengeance in motion. The assault on cultural enemies. The Cultural Revolution gave Jiang an opportunity to settle old score sand. She seized it with ferocity. Many of the individuals who had questioned her credentials in the 1930s, mocked her artistic ambitions in Shanghai, or opposed her marriage to Mao, now found themselves accused of counter-revolutionary tendencies, bourgeois liberalism, or worse. She played a key role in organizing struggle sessions. Public humiliations were accused, class enemies were paraded, denounced, and sometimes physically assaulted. She gave personal approval for arrests, interrogations, and dismissals of party officials, artists, writers, and intellectuals. Among her most notorious victims was Wang Guangmei, the elegant and educated wife of President Liu Shaoqi. Jiang had long envied Wang's grace and social popularity. In late 1966, Jiang orchestrated a campaign to discredit her. Wang was abducted by Red Guards, paraded in a mocking white dress with a ping-pong ball necklace to symbolize bourgeois vanity, and denounced as China's Madame Pompadour. Liu Shaoqi himself, once Mao's closest comrade, was vilified as the commander of the capitalist roaders, and would later die in prison, abandoned and humiliated. Jiang also targeted Premier Zhou Enlai, though more subtly. When Zhou's adopted daughter, Sun Weishi, and his adopted son, Sun Yang, were imprisoned and tortured to death by Red Guards, Jiang refused to allow their bodies to be returned to the family. Zhou was forced to sign his own brother's arrest warrant. Jiang considered Zhou too moderate, too pragmatic, a relic of an old party Jiang was eager to destroy. Political consolidation. From CCRG to Politburo. By 1969, Jiang Qing's power was institutionalized. At the 9th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, she was formally appointed to the Politburo, the highest decision-making body in the party. Her appointment symbolized not only her personal triumph, but the radicalization of China's entire political structure. Alongside her, other members of what would later be known as the Gang of Forzong Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen rose to prominence. Jiang's accession was controversial, even within the party. Many feared her erratic behavior and vindictive politics, but few dared to challenge her directly, for she remained under the protective umbrella of Mao Zedong, whose charisma and authority remained unchallenged even in semi-retirement. Her elevation marked the pinnacle of her influence. She had journeyed from the poverty of Shandong to the peak of the Chinese Communist Party, reinventing herself at every turn: actress, wife, bureaucrat, commissar, and now revolutionary leader. And yet, she remained haunted by the insecurity that had followed her since childhood. The knowledge that her position rested not on the solid ground of institutional consensus, but on the volatile whims of Mao, on the revolution itself. What Jiang Qing had built was not a dynasty, but a storm. And storms, by nature, are destined to pass. Part 7. Factional Feuds, the Fall of Lin Biao, and Mao's Waning Confidence. As the 1970s dawned, Jiang Qing stood near the apex of political power in China. Her ideological crusade had radically transformed the nation's cultural institutions, and she had risen through her association with Mao Zedong and her own ruthless maneuvering to a seat on the Politburo. But power within a revolutionary state is seldom secure, and the very movement she helped orchestrate had begun to turn in dangerous and unpredictable directions. The Cultural Revolution, which had begun as a purge of ideological impurities, had by now decimated the party's bureaucratic core, fractured the military's chain of command, and unleashed millions of Red Guards in a wave of mob, justice, chaos, and fear. Mao, once the principal conductor of this symphony of upheaval, was aging rapidly and growing wary of its unintended consequences. His trust in the radicals was faltering. Even Jiang Qing, once his closest political ally, was no longer immune to his suspicion. The collapse of Lin Biao. From ally to scapegoat. In the late 1960s, Marshal Lin Biao, Mao's hand-picked successor and a principal architect of the cult of Mao, had consolidated immense influence, especially within the People's Liberation Army, PLA. Jiang Qing had collaborated with Lin during the early Cultural Revolution, particularly in campaigns that politicized the military and elevated revolutionary operas. They both shared an unrelenting zeal for ideological purity and the destruction of political adversaries. But as Mao became increasingly concerned with Lin's growing autonomy, Jiang began distancing herself from her former ally. In 1971, the dramatic September 13 incident shattered the fragile balance of power at the top. According to the official narrative, Lin had attempted a military coup and then fled China with his family in a plane that crashed in Mongolia. The details remain murky, But what is clear is that Lin Biao's fall opened a vacuum and Jiang Qing was eager to fill it. Jiang quickly turned against Lin in public, launching and supporting the Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius campaign, which conflated the disgraced marshal with the ancient philosopher Confucius, a symbolic embodiment of feudal conservatism. The campaign allowed Jiang to present herself as the true ideological heir to Mao, the woman most loyal to his revolutionary legacy. But the campaign also had an underlying objective: to discredit Premier Zhou Enlai, who was increasingly seen as a moderating force and a symbol of continuity amid chaos. Zhou had sought to restore order by rehabilitating purged officials and emphasizing national stability. To Jiang, Zhou's pragmatism was heresy. The battle against Zhou Enlai Jiang Qing harbored a deep and personal animosity toward Zhou Enlai. Though they had cooperated diplomatically in earlier years, Jiang came to view Zhou as a rival not just in politics, but in prestige and influence. Her vendetta against him became increasingly apparent in the early 1970s. Zhou had no children of his own, but he had adopted and mentored several young revolutionaries. Two of them, Sun Yang and Sun Weishi, became targets of Jiang's wrath. In 1968, both were tortured and murdered by Red Guards under Jiang's influence. Sun Weishi, a promising theater director and close to Zhou, endured 7 months of brutal confinement. After her death, her body was cremated in secret, and her ashes were never returned to her family. It was a chilling act of vengeance. Zhou remained silent, unable to protest without endangering the fragile political balance or exposing himself to Mao's wrath. He continued to serve the revolution, all while suffering in silence as his protégés and even his own brother were destroyed at Jiang's behest. In 1975, Jiang escalated her campaign with the Criticizing Song Jiang, evaluating the water margin movement, invoking a character from classical Chinese literature to symbolize betrayal and compromise. Everyone knew the real target was Zhou. By using historical allegory, Jiang masked her attacks and cultural critique, but the message was clear. As Zhou's health began to deteriorate, Jiang pushed to ensure that no public mourning would take place. After his death in January 1976, she initiated the 5 no's policy: no obituary, no funeral, no condolences, no wreaths, and no memorial meetings. It was a final humiliation inflicted upon a man many Chinese viewed as the moral center of the party. But the campaign backfired. Public sentiment turns. The rise of popular resentment. Though Jiang controlled the party's cultural and propaganda apparatus, she could not control the hearts of the Chinese people. Zhou Enlai had earned deep respect among the public for his diplomacy, restraint, and paternal presence. When news of his death spread, spontaneous mourning erupted across China, especially among students and workers who had suffered under the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. In Nanjing, protests broke out as early as March 1976, with slogans condemning the party's failure to honor Zhou. On April 5, during the Qingming Festival, a traditional day for honoring the dead, thousands gathered at Tiananmen Square to lay wreaths, poems, and banners in Zhou's memory. Many of these offerings carried indirect rebukes of Jiang Qing, referring to her with euphemisms such as the Empress Dowager, that woman, or 3 drops of water, a veiled allusion to the radicals' names in Chinese characters. Jiang reacted furiously. With Mao's blessing, she ordered the removal of the wreaths, provoking further outrage. The event escalated into the 1976 Tiananmen incident, where security forces violently dispersed protesters. Jiang's attempt to suppress public mourning only amplified her image as cold, vindictive, and disconnected from the people. She had long been feared. Now, she was hated. Fractures at the top, Mao's decline, and Jiang's isolation. As these tensions unfolded, Mao Zedong's health deteriorated rapidly. By 1975, he suffered from multiple ailments, Parkinson's-like symptoms, respiratory infections, and severe vision impairment. Jiang remained close to him physically, but their emotional and political bond had eroded. Mao had come to resent her growing ambition and her volatile behavior. In private discussions with aides, he increasingly referred to her as a woman who represents only herself. Despite their estrangement, Jiang continued to wield the power of association with Mao. She maintained the appearance of loyalty and deference, even as she positioned herself as the revolution's true standard-bearer. She hoped that, upon Mao's death, she could assume an even greater role in party leadership, perhaps even becoming chairwoman of the Communist Party. To prepare for this possible transition, she deepened her alliance with Zhang Chengqiao, Wang Hongwen, and Yao Wenyuan, her comrades in the Gang of Four. Together, they consolidated control over key propaganda outlets, security forces, and industrial committees. They prepared a post-Mao strategy in which Jiang Qing would emerge, not merely as Mao's widow, but as his rightful successor in thought and authority. Yet her grip on power was already weakening. In Mao's final months, Premier Hua Guofeng, a relatively obscure but loyal cadre, emerged as a compromise candidate among party elders and military leaders. In a rare written note to Hua, Mao scribbled, "With you in charge, I am at ease." It was an ominous signal to Jiang that her time was slipping away. She did not go quietly. Part 8. The Fall of the Empress. Arrest, Trial, and the End of a Revolution. In the final months of 1976, Jiang Qing, who, for years, had stood near the pinnacle of communist power as Mao Zedong's wife, political commissar, and great flag-bearer, watched helplessly as her influence unraveled. The death of Premier Zhou Enlai in January had already triggered massive public outpourings of grief and unprecedented unrest. But it was the approaching death of Chairman Mao, the one man who had protected her from both enemies and consequences, that truly signaled the end of her reign. Behind the facade of revolutionary slogans and staged public appearances, Jiang was increasingly isolated. Mao was physically incapacitated and emotionally distant. The inner circle of the party had begun shifting toward Premier Hua Guofeng, a compromise successor chosen not for charisma or vision, but for his ability to unify party and military factions after Mao's passing. Though relatively unknown, Hua now carried the most precious political relic in communist China, a handwritten note from Mao reading, "With you in charge, I am at ease." Jiang, reading the signs, was not content to fade into the background. Mao's death and the funeral of revolution. On 9 September 1976, Chairman Mao Zedong died, ending one of the most consequential political lives of the 20th century. His death left China stunned, mourning, and uncertain. In the days leading up to his funeral, power games erupted behind the scenes in Shanghai, the seat of China's leadership. Jiang Qing tried to assert authority as both comrade-in-arms and political heir. She submitted a grand wreath to Mao's memorial, but conspicuously labeled it not as wife, but as student and comrade. In doing so, she attempted to emphasize her ideological legitimacy rather than personal connection. But her actions failed to inspire confidence. Her speeches were perceived as cold and self-promoting, her presence in meetings divisive. The military elite, the bureaucrats, and even many radical allies grew wary. Meanwhile, Jiang secretly met with members of the 38th Army in Baoding, attempting to rally support and prepare for what she hoped would be a second cultural revolution, a movement to cement her authority and eliminate moderate opponents such as Hua, Guofeng, and Ye Jianying. She also urged the arrest or dismissal of Deng Xiaoping, who had survived numerous purges and was regaining influence. Jiang viewed Deng as the embodiment of capitalist restoration, but her conspiratorial moves failed to win support. Instead, Hua and his allies began quietly mobilizing against her. The coup. October 6, 1976. On the night of 6 October 1976, while Jiang Qing was at her residence in Beijing, believing herself still in control of the party's ideological organs, she was arrested without warning by members of the Central Guard Bureau under orders from Hua Guofeng and Ye Jianying. Her closest political allies, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, were arrested earlier that day, summoned to what they believed was an ordinary meeting at Shanghai. Instead, they were seized and immediately detained. Jiang Qing, taken from her home, was caught off guard, confused, and for the first time in years without protection. When she protested her arrest, one of her own household staff reportedly spat in her face, a symbolic act of disgust from someone who had once served her. With the Gang of Four arrested and the news suppressed for several days, the coup d'état was completed with stunning efficiency. The party announced the arrests on October 21, portraying the Gang of Four as traitors, counter-revolutionaries, and usurpers who had hijacked Mao's legacy for personal gain. The press dubbed Jiang Qing the white-boned demon, a mythological villainess who sowed destruction and disguised herself as something she was not. In truth, Jiang had no real base of support. Even those who had once rallied to her operas and slogans turned away. Her fall was swift, and the purge of her loyalists widespread. The trial of the century. For several years after her arrest, Jiang Qing was held in Qing prison, where she awaited trial. In a society that had no precedent for legal process at this scale, the state moved cautiously. The trial required new legal institutions, updated criminal statutes, and an enormous propaganda machine to frame the narrative. Finally, in 1980, Jiang Qing was brought to trial alongside her co-defendants, the surviving members of the Gang of Four and several former military officials associated with Lin Biao. The proceedings were televised, making it one of the first political spectacles of the post-Mao era and an unprecedented public reckoning for the Cultural Revolution. Jiang refused to be cowed. She entered the courtroom not with humility, but with fury. She denounced the charges, challenged the legitimacy of the court, and repeatedly invoked Mao's name as both shield and justification. "I was Chairman Mao's dog," she famously declared. "I bit whomever he asked me to bite." She denied personal responsibility for the chaos of the Cultural Revolution and insisted she had only executed Mao's will. At times, she sparred with judges, shouted at witnesses, and quoted revolutionary slogans with fervor. When the prosecutor read out the indictment's 48 charges, she retorted, "History will judge me." Though her performance captivated parts of the public and inspired a degree of grudging admiration among younger generations, the verdict was never in doubt. Sentencing and final years. In January 1981, the court sentenced Jiang Qing to death, with a 2-year reprieve. This was a standard legal mechanism in China, often signaling that a sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment if the defendant demonstrated repentance. In 1983, Jiang's sentence was indeed commuted to life in prison. She returned to Qing prison, where she was treated relatively well. She had a private room, access to books, and occasional visits from her daughter Li Na, but Jiang was unrepentant. She reportedly continued to insist that Deng Xiaoping, not she, was responsible for selling out the revolution, and condemned the party's new direction toward economic liberalization. In 1984, she was granted medical parole due to declining health. Moved to a government-run residence under strict surveillance, she lived in relative isolation. She was diagnosed with throat cancer, which worsened over time. Doctors urged her to undergo surgery, but she refused, reportedly saying, "I'd rather die than lose my voice." In December 1988, shortly before Mao's 95th birthday, Jiang attempted suicide by ingesting sleeping pills. She survived, but was shaken. Her health continued to deteriorate, and her requests for increased contact with family or public appearances were denied. Finally, on 14 May 1991, Jiang Qing took her own life. She was found hanging above the bathtub in the Beijing police hospital. In her suicide note, she wrote, "Today the revolution has been stolen by the revisionist clique of Deng, Peng Zhen, and Yang Shangkun. Chairman, your student and fighter is coming to see you." Her death was officially confirmed 2 weeks later, but no state funeral was held. Li Na, her daughter, quietly claimed the ashes. No party officials attended the cremation. Thus ended the life of Jiang Qing, an orphan girl in Shandong, then a celebrated actress, later the iron voice of Mao's revolution, and finally, a discarded relic of the very movement she had helped ignite. Part 9. Burial, Memory, and the Struggle Over Legacy. Jiang Qing's death in 1991 did not bring an end to the debates over her life, her crimes, or her influence. As one of the most polarizing figures of the Chinese Communist era, She had inspired admiration, hatred, fascination, and fear. Her suicide, committed in defiance rather than despair, was a final act of theatrical defiance, a personal judgment on a party that had renounced her, a nation that had rejected her, and a revolution she believed had been betrayed. Her remains were cremated without ceremony, and no public funeral was allowed. The Chinese Communist Party, now firmly under the control of Deng Xiaoping and the reformist leadership, had no interest in honoring the woman it held responsible, at least symbolically, for the violence and devastation of the Cultural Revolution. Her ashes were given to her daughter, Li Na, who kept them in private for over a decade. Burial in the Western Hills. For many years, Jiang's final resting place remained a mystery. In the early 1990s, Jiang, her birthplace in Shandong Province, offered to bury her locally. But her daughter, aware of both political sensitivities and security risks, declined. Even President Jiang Zemin reportedly advised against interring her in Jiang, citing concerns about grave vandalism or the site becoming a pilgrimage destination for leftist extremists. Instead, Li Na arranged a private burial in Beijing. In March 2002, Jiang Qing's ashes were quietly interred in Futian Cemetery, located in Beijing's scenic Western Hills, a region known for hosting the tombs of prominent Chinese figures. Her tombstone is simple. It reads, "The Grave of Mother Li Yunhe, 1914, 1991, respectfully erected by her daughter, son-in-law, and grandson." The name Li Yunhe was one of Jiang's early aliases, adopted during her school years, meaning crane in the clouds. It was a poetic name, stripped of political weight, evoking innocence rather than infamy. It is perhaps telling that this was the name chosen for her memorial, not Jiang Qing, not Madame Mao, but a quiet relic from a childhood long buried beneath layers of revolution and trauma, revisiting her legacy. In official Chinese historiography, Jiang Qing remains a villain. Her image, propagated after the fall of the Gang of Four, is that of a scheming power seeker, a woman driven by personal vendettas, and a cultural tyrant who weaponized art to destroy her enemies. She was likened to the Empress Wu Zetian, but only in negative caricatura, dangerous woman with ambitions beyond her station. In the years following her death, party narratives emphasized Jiang's alleged moral failings past as a Shanghai actress, her rumored affairs, her vindictiveness, and her manipulation of Mao. Propaganda posters and textbooks referred to her as a white-boned demon, a phrase steeped in misogyny, evoking not only danger but unnatural femininity. But even as the party cemented its version of events, counter-narratives emerged. Some biographers and Western historians, including Roxane Wiki, who had once been commissioned to write Jiang's official autobiography, began offering more nuanced portraits. They portrayed Jiang not merely as a political schemer, but as a woman molded by trauma, operating in an authoritarian system where survival demanded ruthlessness. Her early life of abuse, abandonment, and poverty had shaped a personality that could neither forgive nor forget. In these reinterpretations, Jiang was a tragic figure. Fierce but fragile, ambitious but trapped, a woman who sought to control history but was ultimately consumed by it. While few of these accounts absolve her of the cruelty and destruction she enabled during the Cultural Revolution, they complicate the narrative by suggesting that Jiang's rise and fall were also a result of the system that enabled her. Memorialization and contested memory. For many years, visiting Jiang Qing's tomb was an underground act of ideological defiance. During the annual Tomb Sweeping Festival, Qingming, leftist sympathizers and old Maoists placed flowers and banners at her grave. Authorities sometimes arrested visitors or dispersed crowds, treating the act of remembrance as subversion. In 2015, several activists who tried to organize a memorial were detained and taken to police stations for questioning. By the early 2020s, however, the political atmosphere had shifted. Under President Xi Jinping, the Communist Party began cautiously re-emphasizing Maoist symbolism while tightly controlling historical interpretation. Memorials to Jiang were still discouraged, but tolerated if they were small and quietly held. In 2021, marking the 30th anniversary of Jiang Qing's death, a leftist panel discussion was held in her honor, titled "The Role of Li Jin in the History of the Party." Her daughter, Li Na, reportedly attended. That same year, international media reported a surge in Mao-era nostalgia among Chinese youth, disillusioned by inequality and capitalist excess. Some of these young idealists began to see Jiang Qing as a misunderstood radical, a woman who had fought for cultural purity and working-class dignity, only to be betrayed by technocrats and reformers. The Chinese authorities, however, remained vigilant. Surveillance cameras were installed near her grave. Plainclothes officers monitored visitors. Public mourning was discouraged, and official records remained unchanged. Jiang Qing was still part of the counter-revolutionary clique who had deviated from the party's correct path. Jiang Qing in the arts and literature. In recent decades, Jiang Qing has also reappeared in fiction, theater, and film, sometimes as a caricature, sometimes as a tragic heroine. Works like Becoming Madame Mao and Jiang Qing and her husbands explore her psyche, portraying her not only as a symbol of power, but as a woman burdened by the impossibility of reconciling love, ideology, and ambition in a man's world. These works reject the party's one-dimensional demonization and instead pose a more difficult question. Was Jiang Qing the architect of destruction or merely its most visible executor? Part 10. The Revolutionary Stage. Jiang Qing, Art, and the Cultural Soul of a Nation. While Jiang Qing's political legacy remains divisive, her influence on Chinese art and culture, particularly through her controversial reforms during the Cultural Revolution, is undeniably profound. From Yang Bangxi, model operas, to photography, cinema, and literature, she oversaw a radical restructuring of China's cultural identity, one that would ripple far beyond her lifetime. Though she did not originate many of the ideas she championed, Jiang's talent lay in identifying emerging artistic trends, aligning them with Maoist ideology, and relentlessly enforcing ideological conformity through artistic production. She had an acute sense of how art could shape collective emotion, inspire loyalty, and control memory. But her method was not persuasion, it was imposition. The theater of revolution. Art as weapon. Jiang Qing's central belief was simple. Art must serve politics, and politics must serve the proletariat. To that end, she discarded the feudal, mythical, and sentimental tropes of traditional opera and replaced them with stories of class struggle, military heroism, and revolutionary transformation. The Yangbangxi, or model works, became the foundation of this vision. They included the Red Detachment of Women Shajibang Raid on the White Tiger Regiment taking Tiger Mountain by strategy. On the Docks, Azalea Mountain, The White-Haired Girl, The Legend of the Red Lantern. Each was constructed to highlight positive communist heroes, mostly from the military or working class, while depicting their enemies' landlords, traitors, imperialistas, irredeemable villains. Gone were the Confucian ideals, poetic sorrow, and tragic ambiguity that once defined Chinese theater. In their place, clarity, heroism, and a resolute didactic tone. Jiang supervised every aspect of these productions. Costumes had to reflect revolutionary modesty. Lighting and camera angles were tightly controlled to emphasize moral symbolism. Characters were defined not by personal nuance, but by political function. Even facial expressions were regulated. No tears, no fragility, only strength. She implemented her theory of the three prominences. 1. Positive characters over negative ones. 2. Heroes over supporting characters. 3. The principal hero above all. This doctrine meant that the lead figure, typically a proletarian or military revolutionary, would be visually, musically, and narratively dominant. Any secondary characters existed only to reinforce the hero's path. Critics later noted that this rigid structure stifled creative development, but Jiang believed it instilled ideological clarity. And in a country with widespread illiteracy and limited media exposure, these operas became both entertainment and education. Music, language, and clarity. For the masses, Jiang's reforms extended to music and language. Traditional opera, she argued, was too elaborate and difficult for the working class to appreciate. With the help of her deputy, Yu Huyong, she ordered that lyrics be written in Mandarin and melodies composed to match the natural tonal patterns of speech. The goal was to ensure comprehensibility. Every peasant, factory worker, or soldier, regardless of education level, should be able to understand and memorize the content. Lyrics were printed in newspapers. Performances were broadcast on radio and loudspeakers. Some operas were even adapted into ballets and films, which reached rural audiences through mobile projection teams. Jiang's directive that music must build the character became a mantra for composers. Each revolutionary protagonist had a distinct musical theme, triumphant, martial, and emotionally rousing. The villains, by contrast, were given discordant tones and jarring instrumentation. While many musicians and dramatists found this approach artistically constraining, Jiang tolerated no dissent. At one point, composer Du Mingxin was accused of embedding bourgeois melodies in the red detachment of women. Jiang publicly humiliated him, calling his music erotic ballads from 1930s Shanghai nightclubs. Only after he revised the score under Yu Huiyong's guidance did he regain her favor. Behind the curtain, mediation and fear. Despite her artistic passion, Jiang often lacked the technical vocabulary to communicate her ideas. Her criticism was blunt, emotionally charged, and often misunderstood as personal attack. It was left to Yu Huiyong to translate Jiang's vision into actionable instructions for musicians and directors. Yu acted as a buffer, softening her critiques and shaping her preferences into a coherent production strategy. His ability to interpret her vague directives into functional scores helped maintain morale among performers and shield them at times from Jiang's wrath. Still, the atmosphere within cultural circles was suffocating. Fear of failure or ideological deviation haunted every rehearsal. Artists were purged, denounced, or disappeared for the slightest offense. While some truly believed in the cause, others performed out of terror. And yet, for all this, the model operas left a deep cultural imprint. Many Chinese citizens who grew up during the Cultural Revolution remember the lyrics, gestures, and melodies of these works vividly. For some, they are symbols of oppression. For others, nostalgic fragments of a vanished revolutionary dream. Photography and personal expression, less publicly known, was Jiang Qing's passion for photography, particularly landscape photography. Under pseudonyms like Li Yunhei and Li Jin, she submitted dozens of works to national exhibitions. Her preferred style emphasized backlighting, symmetry, and grandeur, an echo of her theatrical sense. She became one of the most frequently featured amateur photographers in China during the 1960s. Her compositions, while artistically solid, also carried political subtext, capturing the majesty of socialist construction, the rural landscape, and the strength of the Chinese people. Her influence extended to fashion design as well. In 1974, she commissioned a new style of women's dress inspired by Song Dynasty robes, which became known as the Jiang Qing dress. Its symmetrical V-shaped neckline and utilitarian aesthetic were meant to promote revolutionary modesty. It was mocked as the nun's robe, but Jiang hoped it would become a national standard. It did not. The paradox of revolutionary art, Jiang Qing's cultural policies were both authoritarian and visionary. She stripped Chinese art of ambiguity and diversity, forcing it into ideological obedience. Yet, she also raised production standards, encouraged innovation within limits, and brought theater, music, and dance to millions who had never set foot in a performance hall. Even critics admit that some model operas achieved a level of technical and artistic sophistication not previously seen in state-sponsored Chinese theater. Their cinematography, stagecraft, and musicality, though constrained by propaganda, were often impressive. In this sense, Jiang Qing was both a destroyer and creator. She demolished the artistic legacy of the past to build a purified, utilitarian aesthetic of the revolutionary state. Whether that art was beautiful or terrifying like the revolution itself depended on who was watching. Part 11. Power, Gender, and the Making of a Political Pariah. At the core of Jiang Qing's life story is a profound contradiction between the woman and the revolution, between ambition and ideology, between the actress who performed roles and the political figure who tried to script history itself. Few figures in modern Chinese history have been as reviled, misunderstood, or mythologized. She was demonized as a white bone demon, romanticized as a tragic heroine, and feared as the most powerful woman in Maoist China. Yet beneath all the masks she wore, Jiang Qing remained until her Dethan enigma that defied easy classification. The gendered legacy. Jiang Qing's rise to power was not just unusual, it was unprecedented in a deeply patriarchal system that rarely allowed women to ascend to high office, let alone shape policy. Yet her power was always precarious, always contested. Her marriage to Mao Zedong, rather than shielding her from critique, became the very basis for suspicion and mockery. While male revolutionaries purged rivals, built factions, and enforced ideology without being labeled monsters, Jiang's actions were often cast through a gendered lens emphasizing her vindictiveness, ambition, or alleged sexual history. Official propaganda after her fall emphasized her past as a Shanghai actress, her rumored affairs, and her taste for Western films and tailored clothises, though her femininity and vanity explained her political choices. Her image was crafted as a kind of femme fatale, a dangerous woman who brought chaos to China's revolution. But Jiang's story also reveals the cost of being the only woman in the room. She was not allowed to be simply a leader. He had to justify every act, every word, every moment of visibility. While her male counterparts wielded power through networks and legacies, Jiang Qing's ascent depended on her relentless performance of ideological loyalty and, ultimately, her capacity to dominate the cultural imagination of the nation. Even Madame Mao, China's only empress regnant, became a symbolic rival Jiang occasionally invoked to defend herself. During her trial, when asked if she thought she could be China's second Wu Zetian, Jiang neither confirmed nor denied the ambition, but the implication had always been there. She saw herself not merely as Mao's wife, but as his intellectual partner, successor, and steward of the revolution's soul, Mao's mirror. To understand Jiang Qing fully is also to confront the shadow of Mao Zedong. Her fiercest critics often repeated her own defiant courtroom statement, "I was Chairman Mao's dog. I bit whomever he asked me to bite." That phrase, while self-incriminating, was also a shield. It placed responsibility squarely back on Mao, insinuating that Jiang had not acted alone, but as the executor of his will. Indeed, many of her most notorious campaigns against artists, intellectuals, and fellow party members were backed, or even initiated, by Mao. Jiang was both his tool and his torchbearer, driven to prove her ideological loyalty even as her personal resentments fueled her cruelty. After Mao's death, party historians would elevate his image while scapegoating Jiang for the Cultural Revolution's worst excessa, calculated absolution of the founder at the expense of his consort. But Mao was no innocent. He entrusted her with cultural authority, encouraged her campaigns, and used her as a battering ram against his political enemies. In many ways, Jiang was the mirror of Mao's revolution stream, theatrical, purifying, and ultimately self-destructive. The private Jiang away from the political stage, Jiang Qing was more complex than the slogans and caricatures suggested. She was highly intelligent, deeply insecure, and fiercely sensitive to slights. She could be charismatic, witty, even charming, as noted by people who encountered her outside the formal context of struggle sessions and political rallies. She loved photography, opera, Hollywood films, and calligraphy. Her favorite actress was Greta Garbo, a woman who, like Jiang, had constructed a public persona around strength and aloofness. Jiang's own calligraphy was so refined that she could imitate Mao's handwriting with startling accuracy, so much so that some of her works were once mistakenly attributed to him. In her later years, Jiang became more withdrawn. Her daughter, Li Na, visited her in prison and during medical parole, but their relationship was strained, particularly over Li Na's husband, Wang Jingqing, who had ties to party security forces. Jiang reportedly resented his influence and believed he had betrayed her trust. Jiang's final years were marked by bitterness and isolation. She believed she had preserved Mao's vision while others had betrayed it. She viewed the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 as a tragic deviation from Maoist principles, reportedly telling doctors that while Mao had never ordered the army to fire on civilians, his successors had committed an unforgivable crime. In retrospect, monster or martyr, history has judged Jiang Qing harshly. The official narrative remains largely unchanged. She was the architect of cultural ruin, the orchestrator of violence, the manipulator of Mao, and the poison at the heart of the revolution. Her name is seldom spoken in Chinese textbooks, and her grave, though now publicly known, is rarely marked with more than a few silent flowers. Yet a generation of historians and artists has begun re-examining her legacy. They do not excuse her crimes, but they challenge the idea that she alone was responsible for a decade of national trauma. They see her as a product of the revolution as much as its architect, a woman molded by poverty, rage, ambition, and ideology. A woman who demanded to speak in a world that preferred her silence. Jiang Qing was not a hero, nor was she merely a villain. She was, in every sense, a tragic figure larger than life, unsparing in her vision, and ultimately undone by the very system she had helped shape.